Welcome to the Design Thinker podcast, where we explore the theory and practice of design. Hosted by me, Donnie, and
me, Peter.
Welcome, everyone. This is season 2 of the Design Thinker podcast. Pete and I have had a little break, and we are back at it. So what are we talking about today, Pete?
Today, Danny, we are talking about keeping going, the power of iteration.
I guess that's what season 2 will all be about.
Yeah, I reckon it's just like the end of season 1, where we talked about starting. Let's make the theme of season 2 keeping going, and that's why we decided to start the season with this episode, focusing on that subject.
Yes.
How do we break this up? Do we talk about keeping going, or should we focus on the power of iteration? You can decide that.
Let's focus in on iteration. I think iteration is something that, as design practitioners, we embrace iteration, but I also think iteration is becoming one of those words that people throw around. And it has different meanings to different people. So let's hone in on what is iteration.
Okay. This is your way of turning the question I asked you back at me, isn't it, without answering it yourself? I'm on to you. Is that what you were doing there? Just before
I was. You are. I think we've been hanging out together too much, because now you're on to all my tricks.
I'm on to all your tricks. Yeah, I need to work on. Maybe by the end of this season, listener, I'll have worked out how to get Danny to answer the question first before me. Iteration, to me, it immediately conjures up in my mind's eye a circle or a cycle. Because to me, iteration is about cycles, and especially, I guess, learning cycles. Yeah, and the circle or cycle that comes up in my mind has a kind of an arrow in it, so you're continuously moving forwards, and hopefully learning something every time you kind of move forwards. What else can I say about iteration? Yeah, it is about learning. It's about putting something into practice, or putting it to the test, to learn from that, putting something to the test. So, and included in maybe an example of a cycle would be something I learned a long time ago, an acronym PEDL, PEDL, which is plan, execute, debrief, and learn. And this is before I started to learn and then practice design thinking. So, hopefully that's self-explanatory. You plan something, you execute it, you do it, then you get together with the people that you collaborated with to plan and execute. You debrief, in other words, you kind of discuss what happened. Did the thing you did, the thing you executed, did it meet your intentions or not? And if not, why not? And then that forms the basis of the learning, which you then carry forward in the cycle to the next plan. That's what iteration. Well, that's the first thing that came to mind when you asked me that question, Danny. How about you? What about iteration? What does it mean to you, and how could you bring it to life for some of the listeners?
So when I think of iteration, I think of the infinity symbol, which looks like, the number 8 turned sideways. Because to me, it's kind of this idea that we're constantly or continuously working to make something better. So, you've created something, which is the starting point. And then there's this continuous effort, the ongoing effort to refine it, tweak it, make it better, get feedback. So I think iteration for me is a pursuit of perfection, a pursuit to perfection, but also accepting that there'll never be perfection.
Okay. Okay. So that interestingly, we both came up with or have pictures in our minds, but they're slightly different. The infinity, I can see that being iterative, of course, and then the perfection thing, you're always kind of iterating towards perfection, but never never actually reaching it. Okay. Okay, that's good. We've got a couple of definitions there. I've remembered that a couple of times in the last season we did a bit of Googling, and I know it's quite early to play the Google card, but my mind did wonder what the roots, the origins of this English word iteration or iterate.
Our first Googling moment for season 2.
Yeah. And also it's a mashup of Google etymology. So we're looking up the Latin. It comes from the Latin word iterum, and that simply means again. And iterum leads to the verb iterare, which means to repeat. So in its simplest form, iteration just means repeating again and again. And maybe what we're both saying is we're not doing exactly the same thing again and again, because we all know the cliched outcome of that, or definition of that. Doing the same thing again and again is a definition of madness. What we're saying is iterating and doing something slightly different every time you iterate. Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Why is it important?
I just want to add before I answer why is it important. I think with iteration, it's not always adding something new. It's either tweaking something that already exists, or maybe it's taking something away. So I think it's important to understand that when we're iterating, it's not like add-ons,
Yeah. Okay. It is just something different.
Yeah.
And that could be adding something on. So that could be start, could be taking something out, which is stopping or removing. And in my mind, it was stop, start, continue. But some things will continue the same. Nice clarification.
So why is iteration important was the question you asked me.
Yes. Yeah.
And I guess I'll answer it. So I think it's important for a number of things, right? Sometimes when we're creating something, it's impossible to know what would work. And so you have to pull something together so that you can, it can be out in the world doing its thing, and we can get feedback from that, right? I also think it's important in the sense of like, we need to move quickly to solve a problem. And we can't wait till we have the perfect solution to go out there. I think it's important from the perspective of that if you take the mindset of working iteratively, then it's easier to not get caught up in the trap of making it perfect. Because you know that it's done, the doneness of the thing is a good enough for now, and that you're going to come back to it and work on it and make it better.
I think what you're saying is that it kind of ties into something. Well, I guess it's directly related to the thing we finished off last season on, which was the power of getting started, wasn't it? Like, you need to get something out there, but it's just as, if not more important, to get something out there and start learning from it. And that maybe that segues into why I think iteration is so important. It's the only way you start, it's the only way you start learning from the real world. Like I get, this is helping me crystallize what I think. What in this context of design and design thinking, we can think of iteration as putting something out of our heads into the real world, and learning from it, learning to see what happens, see whether maybe it's a solution that we've prototyped and we're putting it to the test, and what we're learning is whether it solves the problem we thought it would or not. So iteration is important, because without it, well, maybe this, if we didn't iterate, what would happen? I think if we weren't iterating, let's say we got started and we didn't iterate. Well, without iteration, it means the first thing that you put out into the world is the only thing you'd ever actually deliver. You'd kind of deliver a solution to a problem and walk away from it without iteration. Is that a bit too extreme, or is that fair if you kind of just took away iteration altogether? Just to help me check my thinking there.
No, I think that's fair. But like everything, right? Context matters. So I think that's a fair point. The way I like to look at it is that iteration is giving ourselves permission to put something out there that isn't perfect. I think iteration gives us permission to do good enough and then build on the good enough.
Okay.
And I think it's the building on the good enough, that's the power of keeping going. And I think what you were saying is that without iteration, we would put it out there and stop. And I think that's where the importance of the power of keeping going comes into play, right? I think about it in the terms of our podcast. We started season 1 with this idea that this is a prototype, which gave us, and that we were going to put the prototype out there, and we were going to ask people for feedback, and we were going to tweak it along the way. And we did that, right? In season 1, people gave us feedback and we tweaked little things along the way. When we took a break between season 1 and season 2, we really reflected, like we went back and listened to the episodes and we thought about what can we make different. And then we had to then take that information, and then we had to start recording season 2, which is what we're doing today. But we could have just as easily said, oh, well, we've done a season, we've gotten some feedback, we know what works, what doesn't work, and just leave it at that.
And instead, we've taken the feedback, we listened to the feedback and noted it, and we've done our own reflections, and some things will be different in this season too. Some things will stay the same, some things will be different in this season to the last one. I'm going to come back to something you said, which is a bit of a light bulb that switched on. I think it was there in my mind already, but it's kind of crystallized something. So if we're asking each other or ourselves why is, and exploring this question of why is iteration important, actually, the prospect of iteration, that idea, even just the idea of iteration, can be a really useful, I've written down here, a kind of psychological enabler. It's a way for us to overcome the fear of getting started, knowing that just doing something and knowing that you will be able to iterate that thing that you're doing and make it better and better over time. And kind of making that commitment to yourself, each other, the people that you're designing for, can help you literally just get started. And often, I've myself, but also encountering the people that I've worked with, and there is just a fear of putting something out there that isn't what they perceive as their best work or our best work. It's not the best thing you could ever possibly do. And I think reframing that, or acknowledging that, that nothing is ever going to be your best possible work. It's like your reference to perfection. So reframing it or enabling people to get going by having people realize that they're going to be iterating can just help everybody get going. So a psychological enabler, just the idea of iteration, can be help us get unstuck.
So iteration can definitely, I think, get us unstuck. But let's explore, how does iteration help us keep going?
Yes, that is the title of the episode, isn't it? Keeping going. Well, coming back to my idea of it being learning cycles, what we can do is, if we have the intent of, let's say, Have you got any? What's a good iteration story or example that we can use to talk about how we do it in the context of keeping going?
Well, one thing I've been thinking about as we are talking about iteration is, so I've got my iPencil and my iPad at the moment.
Oh yeah.
And I've got the first generation pen. And one of my frustrations with this is that there is no way to attach my pen and my iPad. So I'm constantly misplacing this. Now the newer iPads, they're magnetic. So like they attach to the actual iPad. I think that's a concrete example of iteration. Like the first one, the first thing that came out was the iPencil that you could write on an iPad with. And I'm sure that people used it and they saw the feedback that, hey, here's what's not working about it. And so when they made the next version, they made that change.
Yeah, nice. That's a nice concrete example. And I remember when Pencil first came out, whatever version of iPad it was with, and seeing people with, there was a profitable line of business for kind of, gadget accessory makers to make clips that you could put your pencil clip
I've
onto
got
the side.
one of those.
Yeah, okay, there you go. So yeah, that's a great example of a real world iteration. You would hope that Apple designers, Apple were paying attention to this, this real world, functional problem that people were losing or dropping their pencils because there was no way to keep it safe. And they created quite a smart simple way to keep it safe or keeping going the part. So yeah, I guess how does that reflect or bring to life keeping going? Well, I suppose Apple could have just ignored that problem that their customers, their users were experiencing and just stopped iterating on that particular device. They could have just decided, no, that's as far as the Apple Pencil iPad kind of pairing goes. You can just buy your own Apple Pencil clip accessories. I'm taking that a bit further. Maybe that would have that diminished, slightly frustrating. Is it frustrating, by the way, before you got the clip? Is it a bit? What's it like?
It was for me because I was constantly misplacing this or dropping it or, and it kind of got to be a little bit of a chore where I felt like the iPad couldn't be mobile. It was fine when I was just sitting at my desk doing stuff. But if I wanted to like go somewhere and work on my iPad, then I couldn't just grab it and go because then inevitably I'd drop the pencil.
Okay. So, let's say you are going to buy a new iPad and the way to keep your pencil kind of safe and you know where it is that hasn't been iterated upon, it's just the same as it was. Would you buy another iPad and pencil?
I would either, if everything was still working, I'd probably hold off on buying a new one because I know I'm going to have the same problem. And if my iPad right now is working fine, then what's the incentive?
Yeah. Okay.
Alternatively, or I guess, or if the iPad was no longer functional and I needed it, I think the other thing I might do is look at, is there a tablet out there that's got a, and I know it's going to shock you, Peter, that I'm going to look at a product other than Apple, but
yeah, well, I guess that
for our listeners, I am an Apple devotee, so
and I should say that I have an iPad and it does have the Apple Pencil 2, which magnetically attaches to the iPad. So we're kind of, I don't know, it's a very real concrete situation, but it's a bit of a hypothetical conversation. But I guess where I'm getting to is, and you, I have to believe that you're telling the truth, that you would actually consider, a Microsoft Surface or something like that if it solved the problem in a way for you that removed that frustration, that inconvenience, that perhaps gave you peace of mind that you're always going to have the pencil at hand, and if you're going to be able to use that device, then what you're saying is you would consider a totally different device. Well, I guess what I'm using that as an example of is the power of iteration and keeping going. Because for Apple, you will be one of millions of people who would have potentially considered another device had they not solved this particular problem. And I know in the grand scheme of things, whether your kind of science fiction device attaches to your other science fiction device, which is sometimes how I think when I'm using my Apple Pencil or my iPad. It's just kind of mind-blowing. I wish my grandparents could have seen it. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not kind of world-changing. But at the same time, solving that problem for people who might be using these devices for world-changing ideas or activities could be quite important. So are we answering how we do it? I guess Apple probably looked at their user problems in the real world and quickly realized, like you are experiencing, how frustrating, annoying, concerning it is to constantly wonder where your pencil is. And they used that observation. That question, I suppose it might start off with, is just how are customers using this device and what's it like to use it, starting with that question and arriving at the conclusion that it needs to be improved, and then figuring out ways to solve that problem and putting it into practice.
Yeah, and I guess the other way to look at it is, what if Apple had decided, it wasn't perfect yet, so we're not going to put it out there, or we don't know everything about it, so we're not going to do it. Then the consequence of that is, until it was introduced, we didn't even know it. We didn't even know such a thing was possible. And until we know that such a thing is possible, we can't know how to make it better.
Yeah.
All right. Like, if you think about it, like if you kind of think about like the first smartphone that came out, we were able to appreciate a touch screen because the predecessor to that was a BlackBerry, which had a tiny screen and, this keyboard. And until the touch screen came along and like your whole phone is a screen, until that came around, we didn't, everybody thought the BlackBerry was the best thing because it was, in the sense that until that point, it was the best thing. So I think the power of iteration the power of keeping going is that we don't know how good something could be until we keep going.
Yeah, that's nice. We don't know how good something could be. Yeah. So that almost, in itself, that's from a desirability point of view, that's almost like a single reason to keep going, is you just don't know how good this thing could get. I mean, I know there's all sorts of other factors involved that we talked about in season 1, like feasibility and viability, but we don't know. That's a good enough reason.
And I think, to be fair and to be on balance, I think we should also talk about, like, are there situations when you need to not keep going?
Stop. Yes. We're kind of going down a bit of an Apple path, but as usual, we're just going with what comes up in conversation in our minds. But when you were describing the iPhone there, what popped into my mind. Well, there's two things actually. One is this question that often comes up quite often with this idea or term MVP, minimum viable product. We'll maybe come back to that because I think there's a relationship between that and this keep going, the power of iteration thing that we're exploring. But the other thing that popped into my mind was, and I think this is an example of stopping going down a particular path and choosing a different path. So I don't know if you remember this, but before the iPhone, maybe 1 or 2 years before the iPhone, there was actually Apple partnered with, I think it might have been Motorola, and they came out with the first iTunes phone. I remember one of my friends had one, and it was shipped. He bought it with iTunes app installed. It was, an old, it was brand new at the time.
Oh, but, I just Googled it.
Oh yeah,
it is Motorola. Nice. Yep, look at that. I don't know if you could see it, but
I can just about see it. Our listeners definitely cannot, but that is the phone. Maybe you could read the model of the phone so listeners can Google that themselves if they really want to. What is it? Describe it.
The Motorola Roker, it was called, the first version of which was formerly known as the iTunes phone, was a series of mobile phones from Motorola, part of the 4 LTR line developed before the spin out of Motorola Mobility.
So, yes. All right. So does it happen to give a year when that came out?
iTunes first became available in January 2001 with the release of the first iPhone in 2007. So
okay. Somewhere between those two.
Yeah.
Anyway, so fortunately, I suppose that Apple, you could, they stopped that. I think they only did that once with Motorola. I don't know the thinking behind it from a commercial or business point of view, but from a user point of view, using iTunes on that Motorola phone was not easy, intuitive. A phone that was you could buy, and similarly at the same time you could go and buy an iPod. So the experience, with the phone, I guess the advantage was it was connected to the internet, and you could download phones and download songs and stream songs from it. But compared to using an iPod, the kind of user interface, the experience was really clunky and terrible. So, let's imagine that Apple and Motorola jointly learned that from putting that product into the market and having real people use it in real life and quickly discovered that it was not good. And they decided, hoping they decided that wasn't the future of mobile music. Perhaps at the same time, Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive were already secretly hatching the iPhone and the iPod Touch. Tony, what's his name? Tony Fadell, Fadell.
Yeah.
He was the third person. He was seen as one of the key parents of the. Anyway, so I guess they stopped. It's an Apple example of stopping and not iterating. They could have iterated that phone and iTunes on it, and it would still have been a really bad experience. Instead, they kind of stopped that avenue of exploration and started another one, and that became the iPhone and the iPod Touch.
I wonder if it might be useful, because I think a lot of times when we talk about iteration, I think it's easy to understand what iteration is when we're talking about a product. But iteration also applies to services, right? So one example that I have is, so we used to use a food service, they would deliver like these prepackaged meals that we can eat during the work week. So when we originally signed up with them, they had 2 delivery dates. You can either get your food delivered on a Thursday or a Saturday. Sorry, a Thursday or a Sunday. They had made the decision that to make it more efficient and a bunch of other reasons that they were going to move to deliveries only happening on Sundays. And they also felt like that would help people set up for the week.
Okay.
And so that was an iteration, right? They used to have 2 days, now they moved to one. Then what happened was they were noticing that a lot of people were skipping weeks. And what they learned was a lot of people would be out and about on a weekend, and they didn't want their food to be delivered and sitting outside. So a lot of people were actually like, if they knew they were going to be away for the weekend, or they weren't going to be home on a Sunday, they would move it to the weekday. And so having the option, instead of canceling it, they would just move when it got delivered. So after a few months of the 1 day a week thing, they moved back to 2 days. So that's another iteration, right? So they thought that they were going to do something that was going to make it better. They did it. Then they, saw what was happening, was paying attention to how is this going. So this is this whole idea of, user experience, user feedback. And then they iterated again, but instead of doing something new, they went back to doing something they had done before. And in this example, that worked. And that's also an example of iteration.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great story. And I particularly love and enjoy what you just highlighted, which is iteration can be a backwards change. That's it's going back to something you did before can also be an iteration. Nice. And I don't know, for me, how did that feel? Were you still a customer then? Did you experience that whole, from state A to state B back to state A? How did it feel to you? What was your, how did you feel towards that company when they went back to doing the way they did it before?
I think for me, it's probably why I ended up being a customer for so much longer, because it felt like, okay, they're listening and they're understanding what the need is. And they're being responsive to it, right? They're not just making a change and going, this is the way forward, and just sticking to it. And then, as a design thinker, like I was looking at it from a design perspective. So I probably, sometimes for me, it's hard being a customer because I don't always know if I'm evaluating something from a design thinking perspective or just as a customer. So I feel like that's a little bit hard to answer. Okay.
You've now got me. I do the same thing. It's often difficult to simultaneously, experience something and prevent yourself from kind of critiquing it or observing it at the same time. What we're starting to draw out, I think, is really specifically how might we, or how do we actually iterate? And I think something key you've drawn out there is gathering data, whether that data is, quantitative. So I imagine that's a great story of a company that listened to its customers and responded to data. Going back to the mental model I mentioned right at the beginning, the plan, execute, debrief, and learn. They planned to make that change. They made that change. Their debrief, you could say, well, I imagine they were gathering data, whether that's in the form of customer complaints or, I imagine they were looking at the number of customers leaving the service, cancelling. So they're kind of debriefing, and then they take that data and then they learn from it. And, they learned that actually the previous iteration, the previous version of their service was better for customers. So they, depending on your point of view, either reverted to or moved forwards again to that. So how do we iterate? We mentioned earlier as well, having some sort of intent, like decide what it is that you're trying to do, have that really well defined, put something out in the world, and then gather data on that. Sometimes I find it useful when I talk to people about even your physical thing, even whether you call it a prototype, an MVP, or just the first version of your product, it can help to think of it as a question embodied, or a physical, whether it's a service or a product. It's still full of questions that you're using that experience to answer. So if you're putting the question out there into the world in the form of your service or product, whether it's prototype, MVP, or whatever, then make sure that before you've done that, make sure you've thought about how you're going to get the answers to those questions, and then what you're going to do about them.
So I think for me, in terms of iteration, I think the only way to really iterate that makes a difference is you have to collect some form of data, and whether that's like you said, quantitative, qualitative, but I think there needs to be that element of hearing people's experiences of, if it's a product or a service, like what's the experience they're having, as well as looking at things like, are people canceling and leaving, or are sales going up or down? I think it's important to pay attention to those, because those can be an indicator that the iteration isn't working, or is having an unintended, it's not delivering the intention you thought it would, or the outcome that you thought it would. But I think equally, you have to engage with the people that are using your product or service, because that's where you really start to understand the why. And I know that sometimes companies will look at, oh, sales are down, let's go do this. But if until you understand why sales are down, you could end up solving a problem that was, or creating a solution, and then having to find a different problem because that solution isn't fixing the problem that you have.
Yes, agreed. And to say the same thing, but maybe in just a slightly different way. It's exactly the same thing. It's about, before you kind of step into your next cycle of iteration, I guess frame up more questions at the end of one cycle. Why didn't this work? Which kind of transitions into the question for the next cycle of how might we make it work better? How might we? So the food delivery service one, I guess you're getting your data, and they're getting the data, and they're going, well, how come people are cancelling our service? And then go and answer that question, and then that leads into, well, how might we meet the needs of customers? Maybe how might we deliver twice a week again? Yeah, we're saying the same thing there, aren't we?
So what does all this mean, Pete?
I was just beginning to think that myself, actually. What does it all mean?
We've talked about iteration. We've talked about keeping going.
Yeah.
We've talked about balancing keeping going with knowing when to stop.
Yeah.
We've talked about why and how. So why it's important is, the pursuit of perfection with the acceptance that we won't ever reach perfection. Why in terms of, we don't know how good something can be until we do it, right? And then how in terms of having intent, collecting data, and then figuring out the right action to take next. We've shared two examples, one of a product, one of a service, of how iteration looks, what it looks like in real life. So now what?
Well, before we do, I'm going to do something you do, which is before we get there, I think there's one more thing. Maybe we need to add the one more thing into our flow. But one more thing, which I think is quite important, is especially if you're working. Well, because you're more than likely going to be working in an organization, and not everybody will be fully understanding of what we talk about here about design and about iteration and taking that approach. Some people may believe that when you deliver what you know or believe or want to be a first version of something, whether that's a prototype, etc., they might believe that's it. And they're, if that's somebody who's sponsoring the product or service, or somebody who's looking after the funding, you might all of a sudden find that you don't have any funding to iterate. So I guess what the one more thing I'm talking about is before you even get to, or when you're in the intent stage of iteration, before you've even maybe even built your first thing, make sure that everybody is clear and understands that the first thing you put out into the world is just the first thing, and we will require resources to continue to iterate. Otherwise, we'll end up in this situation, which happens, a little bit too often, which is the so-called minimum viable product or prototype becomes the only product, and that's detrimental to everybody. So, yeah, bake into that. Bake, I guess, stakeholders of any kind, help them come on the journey, the iteration journey with you. Have them, help you, have them take part in the kind of the intent setting and the learning journey of iteration.
I think equally, Pete, like even just simple things you could do, right? Like label it an MVP.
Yeah.
We anytime, like in the early days when we used to share our podcasts with people, we knew we would intentionally call it's a prototype. We'd love your feedback.
Yeah.
And I think the more that you refer to it that way, like the more it becomes the norm. And then people start seeing it, if you call it what it is, then people start to see it as what it is. So I think just in the way you're labeling the documents or the product, refer to it as the MVP.
Yeah, nice. Good. That gives me the chance to actually ask the question back to you before I answer it, which is what does it all mean?
What does it all mean? I think for me, iteration, what does it all mean, is really about I think there's an element of vulnerability to it, like being okay with putting the first thing out there, knowing that you're going to come back to it, to keep working on it, and to keep trying to move closer to that perfection. I think the power of keeping going for me is, even when you're feeling like you don't want to keep going, like having the courage and, to kind of lean into that and do it. And then also being mindful that not every situation requires you to keep going, that sometimes it's okay to quit. But I think it's important to understand that if you don't keep going, you have to have clear reasons why, and that you're not just deciding to not move forward because you're afraid to.
Yeah, that all resonates really strongly with me. What does it all mean to me? There's something about, and this conversation has kind of reinforced it. I think there's just something really inherently natural about iteration, but at the same time, it can be maybe fear-inducing. It does involve, as you describe it, the vulnerability, because by changing something, then you're acknowledging that it wasn't perfect to begin with. So, the food delivery company, I think it's a really brave, slightly vulnerable move to go, actually, that wasn't working. We're going to go back to what we were doing before. And I kind of back to my comment about the natural, just something natural, inherently natural about iteration. It's just a continuous cycle of learning and change that happens in nature all the time. I think of it as iteration is just moving forward, seeking the answer to the next question, and so on and so on. It's a bit like a tree as it grows; its leaves and branches are reaching out to find the best place to gather sunlight and so on and so on. If that isn't too abstract. So yeah, maybe what it all means for me is that actually the power of keeping going, the power of iteration, it's kind of inherent, it's natural. So it's one of these activities or these mindsets, if you like, that we, if we just kind of clear some noise out away from ourselves as individuals and teams, and it starts to emerge naturally. But when we're coming back into an organization, you need to be really specific and communicate really clearly that we're in iterative mode rather than a final kind of delivery once and done mode.
So what's your key takeaway?
Key takeaway. I think it's a reminder, and thank you for reminding me that even that idea of iteration, before we've even got to iteration, knowing that iteration is ahead can be extremely liberating. It can free us from the tyranny of perfection.
Okay.
I'll drop my mic right there.
Nice. Mine isn't as profound, more of a curiosity. I really want to go do some digging on this iTunes phone thing, like,
yeah.
Because I didn't know that such a thing existed, and I'm just curious about like how did that evolve and what was that like. So I want to go do some digging on that from a design perspective.
Well, let me know what you find out. It could be a good story. Often, in our design stories, where we kind of talk about the things that succeeded, but equally the things that didn't can be just as interesting, just as powerful to learn from, can't they?
Exactly. Well, I think that does it for us for season 2, episode 1. Tune in next time for the second episode of the second season. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Looking forward to it, Danny. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.